live now.
Okay. Shall I start?
Yes, please.
And Sonia, you're not showing your face.
Well, this conversation is between the both of you. I would like it to be that way. So I'll just keep out of it. Two friends meeting up.
No, you're not friends. He's much bigger than not at all. I'm a disciple, maybe. Some sort of. He's a master. So I'm happy to be in conversation with, we call him Sachimash, and I will continue to call him so during this conversation, or Sachida, like Bengalis like to call him. I know him since the 70s, when I was a college student, and he was teaching in Yalkuda Christ College or somewhere. And there was a trinity of poets active at that time, just after modernism came in, Ayyappa Panikar and all. Just after that, these three people came and changed the whole scenery of poetry in Kerala. They were Sachimash, Aturi Verma, and K.J. Shankarapillai. Aturi is no more there. Shankarapillai is in Bangalore with his son. At that time, lots of things are happening in the country, and we were very much worried about what's happening. And his poems really invigorated us at that point. But his poetry did not end with just resistance or opposition to the government or something like that. He had many heartwarming, nostalgic poets about his house and about his village and things like that. And so I think we will start the session with some poems of his, about his childhood, about the return to the house of childhood. I think so. I have, pardon, I'm having a throat problem, so please just had a chippu coffee. So I think Sachimash can start reading some poems. You're muted. Sir, you're muted.
Excuse me, sir. You're muted. Yeah, now it's fine.
Now it's okay.
Yeah, in fact, I have a lot of predecessors in my family who have been thought insane, mad to be more concrete and precise. My grandmother, my mother's sister, my elder sister, my mother's younger sister. So there were three plus one person who was occasionally insane. So that is the tradition which I have inherited, and that is the tradition that in some sense keeps me going, because to live in these insane times, perhaps you need some sort of insanity to be, I mean, to be alive, to survive these kinds of times.
You
So I begin with a
mad
poem
energy.
on my grandma. It's called Granny. I'm reading all the English translations since the whole event is in English, even though all these poems were written in Malayalam and I don't write in English. Well, this is one of my early poems, 1973, Amuma. So I have and all these poems have been translated by me directly. I'm not a very good translator of my own poetry or others' poetry, but well, I keep trying. Granny. My granny was insane. As her madness ripened into death, My uncle, a miser, kept her in our storeroom, wrapped in straw. My granny dried up, burst. Her seeds flew out of the window. The sun came and the rain. One seedling grew up into a tree whose lusts bore me. Can I help writing poems about monkeys with teeth of gold? Well, that is something about the origin or the source of all my poetry. I'll read a more recent poem. I have quite a lot of poems on my mother. I'll read the most recent poem I wrote on my mother. It's called the Enchantress. The Enchantress. My mother was an enchantress. My daughter has seen her dance with cats at night. My mother was an enchantress. My daughter has seen her dance with cats at night. House geckos used to respond to her call. With her index finger, she maneuvered the movements of the spiders at home, leg by leg. A single frown from her, and the cockroaches fell flat, their thin legs groping in the air. When they heard her footsteps, rats returned to the laps of the witches who had sent them. She returned to the owl's hoot and the fox's howl. Even sterile cows began lactating as she stroked their backs. Coconut trees bent down to drop their tender fruits into her thin hands. Mango trees burst into blossoms at her touch. Even the plates and the ladles at home stood to attention at her command. Ghosts smiled at her like neighbors. She knew by heart the lexicon of ants and grasses. Using different synonyms, she changed the rain's rhythms and the wind's beats. She grazed the clouds, lightning for her whip. Butterflies formed a halo around my mother's head. She recognized each crow by what it had been in its previous birth. She found the names of squirrels, reading their lines, summoned them, and taught them Malayalam. Reading the map of her battle's pit, she prophesied father's death on the temple hill. When his clothes came back, she hugged them as if father was still inside them. She prepared meals for guests even before the crows announced their arrival, planted coconut saplings, and sowed vegetable seeds for each of her unborn grandchildren. The only thing mother could not predict was the end of her own world. Sitting in that darkness, I recall that world, the barn in the fields and the paddy measure, the winnowing flat and the bamboo mat, songs of the plowmen and the weeding women, the thorny names of the paddy seeds, and my bleeding black, black roots, and my bleeding black, black roots. Um, Another, I'm reading relatively short poems. Another one is self. My mother didn't believe when in 1945 I appeared to her in a dream and told her I would be born to her the following year. My father recognized me as soon as he saw the mole below my left thumb. But mother believed to the very end that someone else had been born to her, masquerading as me. Father and I pleaded with her, but dreams are not reliable witnesses. She went on waiting for that promised son till she died. Only when she was reborn as my daughter did she admit it had really been me. But by then, I had begun to doubt it was someone else's heart that was beating within my body. One day, I will retrieve my heart, my language too. Again, I have quite a lot of poems about my father. I'll just read a very short one, a rather recent one, where my father sat. Where my father sat on the ancient easy chair, there remains only a mark, a depression that smells of sandalwood and sweat. A piece of the Express daily father read is stuck to the legs of the chair. I used to look up from there and read the other side of the paper father read. Father's spectacle case is still there, though the spectacles now marvel at another world. A dirty towel, a pair of gold-plated buttons father used to wear on his white shirts, a leather purse a friend from Singapore had gifted him, the order of the past that rose when father opened his ebony table's drawers, the melody of a Tamil song about a tree and a bird he used to lull me with. A quartet from Narayaniyam roams around in search of father's voice. At night, the lines turn into four corn stacks. The courtyard sways, a ripe paddy field. Only father is not there, except in some sepia dreams that used to visit me in the early hours of dawn. I will see father soon and give him a peck on his brow with my lips turned blue. A short poem on my daughter. I have many for both of my daughters. This was written when my second daughter was diagnosed with the multiple sclerosis years ago, and she is still living with that. Daughter to Sabita, suffering from multiple sclerosis. I see my 30-year-old daughter again as a 6-month-old. I bathe her, wash away the dust and muck of 30 years. Now she glistens like a short Amichai poem in the liquid glow of heaven. The little towel gets wet with time. Beethoven raises his more than human hands, turning the window bars into piano keys. My daughter emerges out of a symphony to hug me with her rose soft hands. Outside rains Bihag, Kishori Amonkar. If you are not getting bored. The Wheel, another very recent poem. The Wheel. My childhood was a single bicycle tire I called a cart and drove with a stick. A wheel could slip and fall anytime into the cornfield or the river. It was covered in dust of the village lanes, of paddy's husk, of coconut fiber, of mimosa blooms, of consonants and comets. Driving that wheel, I entered my youth. Friends came, loves, poems, countries, books, books. One day, the wheel got splashed with an adolescent's blood. It felt dizzy and rolled on until it reached a huge forest that lay on its back, wreathing and screaming aloud like the wounded Shurpanakha. Running behind the wheel, I lost my way in that green maze reddened by blood. I skipped over some skulls that tried to stop me with their mad, tearful laughter, and heard the voices of men and the rattling of chains. I got lost among them, never knowing whether I was a man or a chain. Then I walked towards the light I saw in front of me, but never abandoned my cart. That light was a will of the wisp. My wheel took me to a new place before I was lost in the abyss. It was a big city. I came across several kinds of people, unseen beasts and unseen trees, lean summer days whose touch burnt me, and dwarfish hunchback nights shivering in the cold. My cart went up and down the accents of languages I had never heard before. On that one wheeled cart, I went round the whole earth, learned to love in many human tongues. Why? Even in the camel's desert language, in the high languages of the llama, emu, and giraffe, in the affectionate leaping language of the kangaroo, the cold lethargic language of penguins, the dripping language of seagulls, and the translucent primal language of the sky shaded by rain and snow. My house was still with me, and the green sun of my village. Even now, my dreams roam in the blankets on that childhood wheel in the company of clouds and eagles. That wheel will still be rolling when I am dead, like the slow hindol of an ancient lullaby, full of wrong notes coming from an old man's throat. And I'll end with a poem that reflects my present. It's called Between 70 and 75. There is a dark place between 70 and 75, broad like memory, deep like death. Those trapped there have no return. They roam about in the childhood bushes or fall headlong into the well of decrepitude. Be warned, if those between 70 and 75 behave like the young, for they are young. They can love, can dance to music, and if need be, even lead a war or a revolution. In fact, they are not dead like most young are. Those between 70 and 75 may suffer from delusions. At times they want a horse ride. At times want to fly above oceans and mountains on the back of an eagle, wander along deserts looking for water that is not there, stand naked in the rain with a poem no one has written yet. There are times when they feel history is retreating its step and feel like crying aloud, screaming almost. The solitude of those between 70 and 75 is sepia, like some early morning dreams or like the friendships in old albums. When they laugh, sunlight retreats into village lanes. Their sweat smells soft like sesame flowers. Their walk is like the descending scale of Saveri, and their lilting speech is littered with gamakas. You wonder why this is all about men. Yes, women do not pass at all between 70 and 75. Invisible to us, they just glide along on a tender rainbow of affection with the soft feet of fairies, fragrant like heaven, and a smile of oleanders, an invitation to salvation. I end this section of my reading here. I've read enough. There are quite a lot of poems, as I said, about my mother, about my father, about my daughters, and I have uh, read a good selection from among them. And I think, yes, we can perhaps initiate our conversation from here.
There are some more recent poems, I feel. Some are recent poems. Sachidanandan?
Rash, if you have something to ask me, I
Yeah,
can't hear you.
yeah. You're not seeing me. Some of these poems are recent poems, I think. Can you hear
Yes, I
me?
think now it's fine.
Hello? Can everyone hear me?
Yes, Rasha, we can hear you.
Yeah, Srinivas?
We can hear you. We can
Hi.
hear you.
Can you? No, what's the problem?
No,
Sachidanandan is not able to
I
hear.
cannot hear you. Sonia?
Sonia may not be there. Uh, hello? Hello?
Ambient noise, Rasha.
You are unmuted, but
Uh,
no voice.
no voice. Srinivas?
I think there is your fan that is on,
Yeah, there is
Ravi
a
Shankar
fan.
sir.
My fan.
No.
Yes.
One second, yeah. 1 second.
With faded paint on her head. One woman goes on waiting at a railway station where no train stops. One woman with a halo of glowworms walks in the dark towards the stars. One woman makes sure her wings are in place before she launches herself into a flight. One woman steps into a cornfield in drought with a rain cloud on her shoulder. One woman sings a song, making a fruit tree in autumn burst into blossoms. One woman glints like a spark of fire in the ashes of her little house set on fire. One woman scoops up her baby and flees to the border, watching the fighter jet swoop down. One woman sharpens the letters of the alphabet and pulls out the fangs of the enveloping dark. One woman closes the door of her house with a bang, walks out, and hums a medley on the street. One woman looks at the image of Jesus on the cross and yells in agony, "Son, my darling son." One woman leaves her man on the panel in Khajuraho and finds her pleasure herself. One woman, her muscles hardening as I look on, turns into a goddess of iron and fire. One woman sharpens her sickle again and again, rubbing it against a rock in a forest stream. One woman climbs up a tank and offers flowers to soldiers with the moon's smile. One woman, tired of her life on earth, leaves for space in a vehicle made of her own bones. One man stands aghast on the roadside, too scared to cross the road.
Darling, can you hear us now?
Now try, Rash.
Can you hear us? Hello?
Yes, Rasha.
Yeah, you can hear me, but
Satchidanandan says, I think his speaker is muted. That must be.
uh,
Will other people hear him?
Yeah, we can hear you.
We can hear him also. We can.
Hello,
We can hear Sachi's.
Sachivaj?
We can hear you.
Yeah, Nirda.
Yes, I can hear you, sir.
So it becomes a one-way conversation.
രവിയേട്ടാ ഇതിലൂടെ ഒരു മെസ്സേജ് കൊടുക്കാൻ പറ്റില്ലേ?
Oh, yes. Oh, sorry. My speaker was off, actually.
Finally, yes, sir. Now we are audible, right?
Yes,
But you could hear my poems, I hope.
Yeah.
Yes,
we heard.
we could hear it. It was perfect.
Yeah.
The
No.
last one
Because,
was
because generally I keep it off and I forgot to switch it on. I'm really sorry. Yeah. Rash, please. Yeah.
Now it's okay. You can hear me.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's lovely that you discuss with me that you your house and childhood and things like that in the beginning. And I had selected 3 poems, and all 3 poems you read from this book. So that's a good way to start the conversation. I again and again I have to go back to 1975 to see you properly. You are one of those poets about whom, like Neruda said, I have a pact of love with beauty. I have a pact of blood with my people. So it's a combination of love with beauty and a pact of blood to the people. So you are a combination of these 2 things. And now you have mentioned some poems about your childhood and like that. But you were born in Pulut, I think, in Thrissur district.
You're right.
Yes.
Yes.
Pulut. And over your education and things like that at that time, you took your PhD, but till then what was the, how did you have your education? Did you have ambitions of writing poetry at that time during that period?
Yeah, as you very well said, I was born in a village called Pulut, which is near Kodungalu, in the Thrissur district in central Kerala. When I look back, I find it was a beautiful village, even though at that point of time I never realized it was beautiful, because as children we take it for granted that the earth is green and you have trees and you have streams and you have backwaters. So I had all these, and it was, I have seen Lake District, which is just celebrated in Wordsworth's poetry, but I don't think my village was any less beautiful than Lake District. Not that I found it like that when I was a child. As I said, it was natural for me. I had to cross a paddy field and walk about, in today's terms, some 4 kilometers to reach my school, which was a very ordinary government lower primary school. And then I went to and even a more ordinary management, an SNDP upper primary school. And then I went to an equally ordinary government high school in Kodungalu. And I began writing, leaving the other aspects. I began writing poetry when I was 13. My first, they were not published. Some of them were published in small school magazines, or we had 2 libraries in our village. One was called Ashan Memorial Library, Kumaran Ashan Memorial Library, and the other was called Kala Kusumam. And the Ashan Library particularly was a well-stocked library. That is where I really started my serious reading when I was about 13, 14. It may be too precocious for a boy of 13 or 14 to be reading Dostoevsky and reading Thomas Mann in translation and reading Tagadi and Keshav and all those and Vailopalli, Vallathol, Idasheri, and all those great poets and novelists. But Malayalam is so rich in translations that I read many of those writers, Indian writers outside Kerala, and also writers outside India in beautiful Malayalam translations. And that must have, in some sense, been a kind of training for me to write, even though I never thought I would become a writer. Even when I began to write, I never thought I would become a serious kind of writer that I am supposed to be today. Yes, I began writing. My first poem was written when I was 13. It was something about dragonflies, the mutability of human life. Because when you are children, you are also philosophers in some sense, and that was published in a magazine. In those days, we had what is called Masika, manuscript magazine. It was published in such a magazine, and then by the time I went to the high school in Kudungalur, where I had to cross a river in order to reach the school. There I began to write a little more seriously. I began to write some narrative poems, and I began translating. In fact, they were born almost together. I was translating Omar Khayyam. I was in the 8th standard when I was translating Omar Khayyam from the well-known Fitzgerald translation into Malayalam. And in those days, I was very fond of Kumaran Ashan. So all those translations were done in Sanskrit meters, which might look very strange for Omar Khayyam to be translated in Sragdara and Shardula Vikridam and Mandakranda and similar meters. But that is how I started, and I was also writing poems in Malayalam in the high school. And I had some teachers who really helped me grow up as a poet. They would send me to all kinds of poetry competitions in the village, at the block level competition, the district level competitions, and I think I did not disappoint them. So I would take part in these competitions. Even though later I realized these competitions do not really test your caliber as a poet; they test only your craftsmanship. Because in those competitions, they would give you a topic and ask you to write a poem on that particular topic within a given time. It was not inspired poetry in any sense, unless suddenly inspiration descended on you. It would just have been an exhibition of your mastery of the craft of verse making. And that's what I did when I was in the school. I was mostly making verse rather than writing poetry. And then I went to Christ College, which was the college more accessible to me. That is the only reason I went there. And I studied science. I was a student of zoology. I really liked zoology, and I had botany and chemistry as my subsidiary subjects. And during those days, I began to take poetry a little more seriously. Christ College had, and even now has, a wonderful library, a very well stocked library with all the major old masters there, collected works of Shelley and Byron and Wordsworth and all the British romantics and the Victorian poets and all that. I began to read all of them, and I spent a whole vacation on reading Shakespeare, complete works of Shakespeare, taking notes, making summaries of the plays. I mean, the stories of the plays only, I can say, and also marking lines and metaphors that I liked very much. That was again a kind of training, a self-training that I had. It was during my second year BSc. That vacation, I cannot forget that vacation because it was so rich, so abundant. It really filled me with poetry because I stayed with Shakespeare for more than 2 months, and that was a sort of a basic training I had. And I was also at that time continuing my translation. But this time I was fascinated by the romantics. I was doing, Wordsworth's elegy. I was translating, some poems by Byron, Childe Harold, for example, and then some poems by, Shelley, especially Ode to the West Wind, Keats's Ode to the Grecian Urn. All these I translated during this time, and I would show. They were not published. I had a notebook which I would show to the Malayalam professor there, even though my second language was not Malayalam, because my friends told me in Malayalam you won't get marks, so take something else. So I first took up a language called Syriac, which I later understood is what is called Aramaic, which is very close to Hebrew. That was the language that Christ used to
Yeah,
speak.
yeah.
I actually heard it when I went to Syria. When I found a lot of people, riding donkeys, and they were speaking a strange language. And I asked my friends, "What is that language?" And they said, "Don't you know? It is Aramaic. That it is in that language that Christ spoke." And actually, we were also going to a church at that point of time. We spent 3 weeks in Syria. I, Teki Daruwala, and myself, and two other poets. And so I tried to study that language, which was called Syriac at that point of time, because it is the language of Syria. So, but then I knew this is not going later. After 2 weeks, I realized this is not going to be of any use to me, because I could get 100 marks there, because it was like learning the alphabet and learning a few words. So, but then I thought, what is the point? So I should learn another language. Malayalam is something I can learn myself. By the time I knew that, so I thought, okay, I would take Hindi, which was the second best choice. And then I took Hindi for my second language, which helped me much years later, when I began to go to Bhopal, to Bharat Bhavan, to take part in Kavi Sammelans, and also when finally in 1992 I moved to Delhi. That basic Hindi I learned during my degree days. It was of immense help when I came to Delhi, and later I picked up more Hindi, and I could very easily translate from Hindi into Malayalam. I could follow some Punjabi, I could follow Urdu very well. So all these, much later, that study of Hindi helped me. I translated Kedar Singh and Kumar Narayan and some of the major poets of Hindi into Malayalam, with that Hindi, and with the new and improved Hindi I learned from my days here in Delhi, from where I am speaking. Well, so in the school I had Raghavan Master, Neelakanta Das, who was a Malayalam Vidwan, and they really encouraged my writing poetry and reading poetry. And in the college again, I had Mr. John, who was a librarian, who was a great reader, and so he would suggest to me the kind of books I should be reading. And one of the books obviously was the Holy Bible. And I spent as much time on the Bible as I did on Shakespeare. And Bible has been to me an inspiration throughout my life. I have so many poems, around Jesus and around various episodes in the Holy Bible. And then I began to read, as I said, the Victorian poets and and the Romantic poets and all that. And by the time I completed my BSc in zoology, well, I was supposed to go to medicine, and that is why I studied zoology. And I did some special training also to write the medical examination. But then I knew I was not going to be a doctor. I didn't really want that kind of a busy life. I wanted to be something of a writer, or at least a good reader. So I thought I would take up literature. And the best place around my place in those days to study literature was the Maharaja's College, Ernakulam, because I couldn't go all the way to Brennan in Tellicherry and all that. That was another college. And the third college was University College, Trivandrum. These were the three most well-known colleges of the time. So I joined Maharaja's College with the kind of good marks I had in English for BSc. In those days, it was possible. I don't know whether it is possible anymore. So I joined MA, and that again took me to even more serious reading of poetry, and a very intense study of literature in general and poetry in particular. And we had wonderful teachers like Professor T.R. Kemarar, Professor Radhamani, Professor Balakrishnan Nair. So some of them were absolutely inspiring, and they would tell me and tell us all about the kind of books we should be reading. And Maharajas had, of course, a very old and well-established and well-stocked library, which again helped me. And by that time, I had already begun publishing poetry in printed journals. It happened while I was studying for BSc. My first poems were published in the college magazines, and also while I was doing my degree, some of my poems appeared in one of the weeklies, which was very well known at that point of time, called Jaya Keralam, which came from Chennai, which was called Madras at that point of time. So Jay Keralam was edited by someone called Appukutti Guptan, and he liked some of the poems I sent him, and he began to publish them. Then I published in Janayugam Weekly, so by the time I joined Maharajas, I was something of a small poet, or what I can very well call a poetaster, which would be the proper word. Now I began to take poetry seriously. And the first thing I did when I began to take poetry seriously was to stop taking part in poetry competitions. I said no more competitions for me, because, as I said, they do not test my imagination. They do not test my inspiration. They are tests of my craft. A craft I would study myself. I don't need to go to competitions and win prizes to do all that. So I began to focus on poetry, and I was introduced to modern poetry. T.S. Eliot and W.H. Auden, and quite a few of them were part of the syllabus. And outside the syllabus too, I began to read a lot of European poets at that time as an MA student, because I used to visit Pi and Company. I was studying on a scholarship. I couldn't afford otherwise my fees. So I would spend a part of the scholarship on buying books from Pi and Company, which was on the Broadway in Maharajas College, which is no more there. Now they have a small shop where they sell magazines. At that time, it was a very well-stocked bookshop. And that is the time when Penguin European poets, Penguin modern poets, all these series were coming. And there were also bilingual anthologies of German poetry, Spanish poetry, Italian poetry, and all that. So I would buy them actually. And that was when I began to have a good collection of poetry, which has now become a very huge collection, perhaps one of the best personal collections that anybody might have in the country. So that was the time when I began to pick up these books of poetry and focus on them, study them, try to understand how they constructed the lines, and translating some of them helped me study the craft of poetry better, because it is like studying painting, like a student looking at a master painter, painting how the line is drawn and how the hues, the colors and shades are used. And translation is an activity like that. It's a kind of intimate reading, as Gayatri Spivak would say. So and through translation, I learned how the imagination of these great poets worked, how they arrived at their images and their similes and all kinds of figures of speech, etc., and how they tried to express things with a kind of beautiful indirectness, which is the very soul of poetry. And all these things I learned from reading and also from translation. So then I came out of Maharajas College. Immediately, I got the job of a lecturer in a college which was just next to my house, actually, called Kodungalur Kunjikutannapuram College, where I taught for 2 years. It was a management college at that time. They didn't have money to pay our salary. So then I thought I cannot live without my pay. And so, but already I had an invitation from Christ College, where I was a student, and I was supposed to have been a good student. So Father Gabriel, who was the principal, had already written to me when I was a student of MA, please, when you finish, just come and join here in the English department. But now I thought, okay, I have served my village enough. I cannot serve anymore on this low pay. So I went to Christ College and joined the Department of English there, where I remained for more than 24 years. And then by the time I had already begun to publish, and then I began to publish in well-known weeklies like Madhubhumi Weekly, etc., and also in many little magazines. I was part of the little magazine culture, as Ravi very well knows. So I ran my own little magazines then and later, Jwala, Uttaram, quite a lot of little magazines. And yes, and I also wrote a lot of, I also translated, I read. I was part of a group called Kerala Kavita, led by Ayyappa Panikkar. He was the editor, and we were the founders, 20 of us. We took some money from our salary and we founded this journal. And some of my earliest poems appeared in Kerala Kavita. A poem like Anju Suryan appeared in the first issue of Kerala Kavita in 1967. And from then on, I began publishing and I had a small group of readers. I would not say it was a big group, or it is a big group even now. I'm not at all particular about having a very big group of readers. I have my own readers, and I'm very happy with them. Well, this is how I grew up, encouraged by teachers, reading books, visiting libraries, collecting books, translating poetry, observing life, observing nature. Well, these were some of the things that really trained me as a poet. And I have said in one of my talks that the rain trained my me in the trained my voice. The many voices of the rain, the many tones of the rain, that also gave me the tones of my poetry, whether in prose or in verse. This is in brief, the kind of training I had right from age 13 onwards. And I am still a trainee. I never consider myself a master, even though Ravi said I am a kind of master. I never. I when I sit before a blank page, I am like any poet. I am like a beginner, because what I have to say is not something I have said or anybody has said before in the particular fashion in which I am going to say. I mean, there are so many love poems, but the love poem I want to write is my own love poem, not what others have written. And so I stare at the blank paper, or the blank paper stares at me, and we have a kind of an encounter, staring at each other, and finally words begin to form, lines begin to form. You strike off lines, you add lines, you change words, you change their places, and finally you arrive at some kind of a form which looks all right, like Idasheri used to say about the writing of his poetry. He would finish his poem and read it to his wife when he felt like a blacksmith, that well, this looked like a knife, and this is good enough. So, and he would ask his wife, do you think it is a poem? It can pass for a poem? And his wife would say, yeah, yes, it is a poem. It can be published, and only then he would send it off to presses. So, well, this is how most poets write, and that's how I also grew up writing. And I still consider myself a beginner, as I said, because when I sit to write, I know I have something new to say, and I have to say it in a new fashion, and hence I am a beginner before I write any of my poems. Thank you. I have taken a lot of time.
Yeah,
Raj, you can go on. Yeah.
but you started with getting involved with literature. Uh, Literature involves fiction also. Why didn't you go into fiction? Why did you choose poetry as your vocation or the area of interest? You did not become a
Uh,
fiction writer, no short story writer or a novelist. So you are
yeah,
very
actually, as you may know, Madhubhumi Public Books has just come out with my first collection of short stories.
ah.
I began to write short stories when I was 72. I'm going to be 75 soon. So, but these short stories are also not very different from my poems. If you have read them, you will know they are a kind of fantasies, and they have much to do with poetic imagination rather than fictional imagination. But yes, poetry always remained my first love, because that is what first came to me. That is what I read most, and that is what I love most among the verbal arts. I love poetry more than any other art, even though I love other art. I'm a lover of music. I'm a lover of painting, as you very well know. I have written a series of articles on modern art. That was long ago. And I have written quite a few poems on music. I've written a poem on M.D. Ramanathan, one on Kumar Gandhar, one on Mallikarjun Mansoor. And even recently, I wrote a poem on music. I've written some poems on dance. So I love all kinds of arts, because all of them ultimately feed my poetry in some sense. So even the love of other arts, in some sense, is an extension of my love for poetry. And it was from poetry that I went even into my activism, or my politics, or my resistance, or whatever you call it. Even that actually came from my poetry. I first began to write. and I found some impediments to write, and that's what actually led me more and more towards some kind of a politics, even though I have never joined a political party and I don't mean to. But well, if I became political at all in any sense, even in my writing, again, that was through poetry. So poetry was my source in the source of every kind of thing that I did and that I continue to do even today. And so, well, that was my first love, and now at this age, I can say that's going to be my last love too.
But how did you come to write the short stories at the age of 72?
Yeah,
What
well,
inspired
yeah,
that?
you know, I loved writing. I loved reading fiction. I have read the best of
Yes, I
fiction in
know.
around the world. You know,
Yeah.
European fiction, mainly European fiction, and I have a good collection of fiction also. But I always loved fiction which was not prosaic and what is called realistic. I loved Italo Calvino. I loved Borges. I loved Marquez. I loved Yosa. So writers like this, and not many realist writers, because even Dostoevsky, I don't consider a realist writer in that sense. He was a kind of, there was a kind of metaphysics in his writing, and a lot of poetry in the way he conceived Ivan and all the characters in Crime and Punishment, or or his other novels, so even when I was reading fiction, in some sense I was, and still I am looking for poetry. So when so one day I had written some plays in the 70s. I had written a play called Shaktan Tamburan. I wrote a full-length play called Gandhi. That was in 1990, which was later staged in 90 places in Kerala.
You got
An
an award
abridged
for
version,
that.
not the full version. So writing, so I had written plays, I had written literary criticism, I had written poetry, and I had written some ghazals, as you very well know. Mumbai has sung, those ghazals. There is a whole album of my ghazals, and some of them were also later taken by some filmmakers with my permission. Even though I am not at all interested in becoming a film writer,
There's a
but
book.
some of my poems were taken and sung by M. Jayachandran, the music director, and all that. But that is most unimportant. I have forgotten which poem it was even. But then, so I had experimented with many forms. But then one day, like the ghazals came to me when I had a surgery and I was taking rest. Because rest for me is something very rare. I am somebody who works throughout the day. I mean, from my childhood onwards, it has been my way of life. But after a gallbladder surgery, my gallbladder was removed because of stones. I had to take compulsory rest for some 15 days or so. And then these ghazals began to come to me. Somebody was singing in my ears, and I began to take them down. And then at the end of 15 days, I found I had written about 21 ghazals. And then it became 50. And I published a book, Green Books, Haritam Books has published a collection
Yeah.
called Ghazaligal Geetangal, when songs and ghazals. And short stories actually came to me like that. Most of these things come to me around 2 o'clock at night. My wife very well knows, because at that time I suddenly wake up, I go to my table, I switch on the light, and I have kept a table light so that I don't wake her up. So sometimes I write the whole thing, or very often I write what comes to me. It may be a line of poetry, or it may be the plot for a story. And one day, I found it was the plot for a story rather than a theme or a mood for a poem. And so I developed that into a short story. I sent it to Madhubhumi Weekly, and they said, "Yes, this is a wonderful story," and they published it. And then Madhubhumi began to publish me. Malayalam Weekly published me. And when I had enough for a collection, and Madhubhumi Books said, "We would like to." DC Books also wanted. There was a kind of competition between them, strangely. But finally, because Madhubhumi had published most of my stories, I said, "Well, you can publish them." So that book, it is called Anantharam, and that particular story is a kind of a second part to O.V. Vijayan's Khasakinde Idihasam. It is Ravi
Oh,
coming back. He does not die of the snake bite. He
okay.
comes back, and then he finds a changed world. He finds all his characters like Maimuna, all of them have grown old. The village Kazakh has changed so much and all that. And some of you must have read that story. Well, so that was how, so stories also came to me like poetry. That's what I really wanted to say. And so I do not resist beyond the point. When something comes to me, whether it is a play or a story or a poem or a song, I do not resist it. Well, I allow it to come or let it come. And if it looks good, finally, I don't mind even publishing that. And that was how stories came to me. Without my ever dreaming, I would write short stories in my life. Yes. And I don't know whether I would write again. After that book, I have not written any story. One story is just developing, but I don't know whether I will write it at all. So, yeah.
So when will a novel come to you?
No, not at all. Because novel, I think needs another kind of imagination. There are two kinds of things. One, you need a structural imagination, and you need a kind of sustained engagement, which I find sometimes difficult. In reading a novel, it is fine. I can read a novel in full in a day or two. But writing a novel is another cup of tea. It's not mine. Like Mugundan does, because I have a lot of novelist friends. Mugundan was my neighbor for many years in Delhi when he was there. And Mugundan used to tell me he would wake up every night, every morning at 4 o'clock and write up to 7 o'clock, because he was very busy in the French embassy with his job at that time. He had no time during the day. So it needs that kind of. So he would first make an outline of the plot, and he would imagine the characters. All that would be done first, and then he would begin actual writing. And it's almost like following a timetable, which is something I can never do. I cannot write a poem or anything following a timetable. So I don't have that kind of imagination or that kind of work culture or whatever you call it. So I don't think I will ever be able to write a novel, not even a short one, even though I have written some long poems. One of my early poems called Atma Gita was a book. Actually, it is dedicated to my wife. And later poems also, like Anandam, and then Apurnam. These are all very long poems. But that I can perhaps do. Yes, but not novels.
Atma Gita had some 26 chapters or something. It's a very longish poem. Atma Gita.
Yeah, it is long. It is long with 3 cantos and invocations. Yeah.
So I find that you're spanning almost 50 years of literature, 45, 50 years of literature. But now you have added more years to it because you started writing at the age of 13. So I calculated from 20 onwards. So 7 years added to that. So
no, but those years I don't take as years of serious writing. Well, I was scribbling, I was training myself. So I would begin to count my work only from 1965 onwards. That is how my collected works are published by DC also. It begins from 1965. So that was how my 50 years of writing was celebrated in 2015. In my there was a reception in my village, a reception in my town, and DC Books organized a huge gathering. They brought out my collected works. All that happened at that point of time. So from 1965, one can say I began to take myself seriously, even though others perhaps began to take me seriously a little later. But I think now a few people do, and as I said, that is enough for me. If a few people take me as a serious writer, that is good enough.
That collection starts with the poem you mentioned, Anju Surya.
Yes.
Right. And your collection is divided into 3 volumes of poems. And they are in Sangam style. They are named
Aham poems and Puram poems.
How will you distinguish that?
Yeah, it is very much like the Sangam, like the meanings they have in the Sangam tradition. Aham poems deal mostly with my personal life, my domestic life, my inner life and all that. While the poems in the Puram part they deal with my poems on society, poems on others, poems on topics which are not entirely personal or entirely individual. And there is a third volume which I added to the Ahampuram traditions called Mori. And these are poems about language and poetry alone. All those poems are, I have a lot of poems on Malayalam poets, a whole series. I have a lot of poems on Bhakti poets and Sufi poets. I have a lot of poems on poetry itself, and and I have a long poem called Malayalam on the Malayalam language. So many of all these poems you will find in that part called Mori. Or later, after 5 years, DC brought all of them together in a single volume. Satchidanandan Kavithagal, 1965, 2015. Yeah.
But the Sangam period, you have translated Sangam poems also, I think. No?
No, I have not translated, but I have read them because I could read them in the original because I could get a transcribed. I don't read Tamil very well. My daughter can read Tamil very well. Sabita can. She consciously studied Tamil herself. She picked up and then she was tutored too. But I can't. But Vettam Mani, he's a great scholar who wrote the famous Purana Nikhandu, which is one of the best lexicons of mythological lexicons we have. So he also started, he did not complete it, something called Randairam Varshatha Malayala Kavida. I mean, the Malayalam poetry of 2000 years, which might look like an exaggeration because Malayalam does not have that long history. But Mani believed that because many of the Sangam poets also lived in what is today called Kerala, so he thought that was also part of the Malayalam tradition. And remember, it was by this argument that we also got the classical status, because I was in the academy at that point of time. So MGS Narayanan and other people were in the committee, and they argued that Malayalam and Tamil had a common prehistory. And then they parted ways, and Malayalam, adding Sanskrit and all that, Malayalam developed its own individuality, and Tamil became an independent language. But that prehistory also should be taken into account when you speak about the history of the language. And that is how Malayalam was given the classical status, because the minimum condition was it should have a history of 1,000 years. But when you really go back to modern Malayalam works, you can go back to, say, 15th century Chersheri, or 16th century Elthachan, or maybe to some of the folk songs even before that, but not 1,000 years. But 1,000 years it becomes, if you add Sangam poetry and some of the ancient Tamil poetry, which some scholars say belong both to Malayalam and to Tamil. It's a common tradition, classical tradition that we have. So I haven't translated them, but Vettamani brought out 2 volumes of ancient Tamil poetry, where the Tamil poems were written in Malayalam script. And the difficult words, many words we can understand, as you very well know, but the difficult words were the meanings of the difficult words were also given. And so it was easy to read the original and then look up the meanings of difficult words. That was how I got intimately familiar with the Sangam poetry. And I have written a poem called about the Sangam poets, which is very popular in Tamil Nadu. Wherever I go, they introduce me, because they love their mother tongue like nobody else. And so they would sing that poem, and they would introduce me as the man who wrote this poem, the Kavinyar who wrote this particular poem. So,
Kavinyar Satchidanandan. Actually, I went in search of some Sangam poetry for translation sometime. And it was interesting because in Tamil, all this is
in fact,
kept in volumes. Hello. 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 Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me? Hello.
Yeah, my connection seems to be a little unstable.
Now you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, now I can.
Now you can.
Yeah.
So all this all this were kept in different volumes. And for finding the context and meaning, you have to read from one book to the other, and from that
Yeah.
to the other. It was a chain of books which we had to refer. You will not get it from one book.
That is true. N.V. Krishnavariar has done Agananur and Purananur, and Padittipatta has also been done. And then, of course, there's a beautiful translation by Rameshan Nair of, Shilapadigaram. And there are a few other books also of Tamil poetry, and Attu Ravivarma has partly translated even Kampa. He was doing it when he passed away, unfortunately, but he has done quite a bit of it. Earlier, Dr. S.K. Nair did a bit of Kampa. So, and modern Tamil poetry, again, Attur has a beautiful collection of modern Tamil poetry, both from Tamil Nadu and from Sri Lanka. And I have also done some contemporary Tamil poetry, sitting with the Tamil poets, especially with Sukumaran, who was earlier with Surya TV and who is a very fine poet and was translated my poems into Tamil, one of the many translators in Tamil. We are somewhat familiar with the Tamil scene, both the ancient Tamil scene and also the contemporary scene. And quite a lot of those poets I know personally too, like Salma Puttadevati and Manushya Putran, and quite a lot of them actually. Yeah.
Right. So let's go back to that. How much time we have got? It's 7:17.
Okay. Yeah.
I think we can take about 10, 15 more minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
Because there are a couple of questions that have also come in.
Oh, fine.
Would you like me to read them out to you, sir, right now, or do you want to wait for a bit?
Wait. I have something to ask. I have something.
Yeah. Please do. Yeah.
Because we have not yet come to Indian English poetry. We are still stuck in Malayalam poetry.
We are certainly taking our time.
What?
We are certainly taking our time coming around to it.
Yeah. You translate your own poetry into English.
Yeah.
So there used to be a misunderstanding that you are writing original in English.
Yes.
I think, and you have clarified it many times. But one can't find any difference. Which do you prefer, the Malayalam original or your own translation?
No, personally, of course, I write in Tamil. I write in Malayalam because I am committed to it in some sense, and poems come to me in Malayalam, even today. And I have translated about 65% maybe of my poetry into English, because I find quite a few of them are very hard to translate. I would not say untranslatable, but hard to translate. See, a poem, and they are some of my more popular poems in Malayalam, like even a Kudi, for example, about Vailopalli, which is one of my most famous poems in Malayalam, or a poem like Kolipang, where the music becomes very important, where the sound element is important, or where the local culture comes in a very big way. It is I find it very difficult to translate. So I don't touch them. Maybe later somebody else may dare do that, but I am not doing them anyway. So yes, because I began publishing these translations of poetry also, right from the 70s at least, in various magazines, like Jayanta Mahavatra's Chandrabhaga and various other little magazines, and later the London Poetry Magazine, and quite a lot of magazines around the world. Of course, always I said translated from Malayalam by the poet, and they published it also with that that footnote. They are translations from Malayalam. But then there are some Indian poets writing in English who consider me an English poet in spite of my resisting it. Jeet Tail is an example. He was the first one I had to encounter, an anthology editor who insisted on including me in his Penguin collection called 60 Poets. It came out first as a special issue of Fulcrum, edited by Philip Nikolaev from the US, and later Penguin. They published it from abroad, and later there was an Indian edition also. So Penguin brought out those 60 poets, which I think is one of the finest, because Jeet has a wonderful sensibility. It is one of the finest collections of Indian English poetry available at that particular point of time. And so he was very particular. He should include my poems. And I said, Jeet, how can you do that? I write in Malayalam. These are translations, and you cannot include me in in Indian poets writing in English. But Jeet said, Sachida, we consider you one of us. We consider you a poet writing in English because you are bilingual ultimately, and we have had many bilingual poets in the Indian English tradition, like Kamala Das, like Jayanta Mahapatra, like A.K. Ramanujan, and you are also in that sense bilingual because you write in Malayalam, but you say you are translating, but in some sense it is a kind of recreation of those poems in English, and so we consider your English poems to be part of the repertoire of or the whole corpus of Indian English poetry. And so finally I had to yield. And now I find that at least in 4 or 5 anthologies of Indian English poetry, I am there. And even in some of the anthologies which are going to come out, I am very much there. Even though everywhere I have tried to make it clear that I am a Malayalam poet, and I continue to say I am a Malayalam poet. But yes, I do translate because I began translating on compulsion. Ayappa Panikar wanted some of my poems for one collection, one anthology, and then some journal editors began to write to me, and so I began. And also before that, some other people had translated my poetry, which I did not like very much. Then I translated. I did not like it very much, but I certainly liked them better than what others had done. And so I said, well, in that case, I should try myself. And that is how it all started. And then it became a kind of habit. Now, whatever is translatable, I translate almost as soon as I write the poem. So I have my new collection coming out in a month or two from Copper Coin. And 4 collections in English have come out in 2021 already. Yeah.
I was one of those people who tried to translate your poems at that time when I was 20 or 21. This Pani, Naumaram.
Oh, yeah. Naumaram has a translation done by an American gentleman with somebody in Trivandrum that has appeared in a collection of anti-emergency poems, actually. Yeah. I know you are a wonderful translator because I'm extremely impressed by your translations of both Malayalam and Tamil poetry, and we have very few people who can translate from 2 languages with equal competence and also write in one language with the same kind of competence. I have been an admirer of your poetry and also your translation, frankly and honestly.
Thank you, sir. About coming back to Indian English poetry, unlike your times, now poetry has become more global. Like the market has become global. So many online magazines and social media portals have opened, and there are more chances for poets to. There is more chance for poets to. You can hear me? Hello.
I can hear you.
There is more chance for.
There is some sound. Are you also getting some kind of sound? I don't know. Yeah.
No,
but I can hear you. You can.
Yeah. So many avenues are there for publishing poetry now.
Yeah, that is true. There are anthologies coming up. There are online journals. There are printed journals. Quite a lot of them.
But are these all coming at the expense of vernacular poetry? Because it's all metropolis center in English poetry. They get more attention than vernacular poetry in the global market. The global level.
Yeah. In fact, you are right in some sense. Most of the poets writing in English are concentrated in the cities. Even though there are wonderful poets who write from smaller places. Look at somebody like Gopal Honalgare, for example, who wrote a very, very different kind of poetry, very different from the poetry of Ramanujan or Ezekiel, or he was almost a contemporary of many Adil Jasawala and all that. They are all very fine writers, but Gopal's poetry is something entirely different because his sensibility comes from his mother tongue, even though he writes in English, and that makes his poetry very, very different. And you will find something of that even in Kamala Das. because I have seen, poets like K.K. Daruwala, for example, being very critical of Kamala Das's grammar and all that. He says that no, this is not good English, but that is because she also, as all of us know, was a great Malayalam fiction writer. Later, she wrote some poems also in Malayalam, and something of that culture, seeped into her use of English, and that made her English very different and very close to her mother tongue. And so I think there is a kind of bilingualism in most of us. Maybe it is getting lost in the coming. I cannot say that about the younger generation who are becoming more and more monolingual. They may not even know their mother tongue very well. It's not their fault. Either they were educated in English, or because they lived, their parents lived outside Kerala. So for various reasons, they are getting delinked from their own mother tongues, and so they are forced to write in English, which is like a mother tongue to them. I won't blame them for that, but somehow most of the poets even today who write in English are concentrated in larger cities, metropolises. So you have a Bombay School of Poetry, you have a Delhi School of Poetry, and now you have even a Madras School of Poetry. There are very good poets, of course,
Bangalore School of
Swami
Poetry.
and Srilata and all of them, and yes, I need to name them. So there are very very fine poets writing, but I think there are equally good poets writing in the languages, even though all of them are not translated into English. Some of them are. Now they are getting more and more translated, but earlier, because for various reasons, because they could not find the competent translators, they were not translated. But I find when translated, that the poetry of somebody like Jeevan Nara from Assam is as good or even better than many of the poets who write in English. And this I can say this at least about some 80 poets writing in the different languages of India, whom I know, whom I have read either in Hindi or in English. So I have myself translated Kedarnath Singh, as I said, and I found those poems equal to any poetry being written in English, either in India or outside India. So I do not feel that the language poetry is in any sense inferior. But as you said, there is a kind of crisis there because of the education the young receive, and also the company they keep, and the fact that their parents most often, for reasons which are for which they are not responsible, have to live outside Kerala, spend a major part of their life outside Kerala. So, and that has also helped Indian English poetry in a sense, because now there's a whole new generation writing in English.
Anyway,
So it works both ways.
This opening up has helped Indian English writers. Even a writer like me could come up only because of Facebook and social portals like that. Anyway, and I wanted to put a question to you. This creative writing courses, how will they help a poet to emerge from them? Because
I have
creative writing courses are
I
only
understand.
in English. They are not in vernacular. You don't find creative writing courses in Malayalam or Tamil. Only in English you find them.
Yeah, that's true. I have never attended a creative writing course, and I don't think I'm going to attend one. But I had to take part in many. In Kerala, they are not called creative writing courses. There are no regular courses, but there are what are called literary camps, Sahitya campuകൾ. And I have been there after I became a writer. I have never been there as a participating member, but I was there as a kind of, if you want to call it a teacher, or speaking about poetry, reading poetry, speaking about the craft of poetry and all that. So that is the kind of training that language poets most often get, attending these courses where many senior writers come and speak about the art of poetry. Not only speak about them, but the young writers read their poetry, and then we discuss and analyze those poems. What are the pitfalls? What are the strengths? And what is the way in which they can develop their linguistic skills, their style, their image and metaphor, their way of imagining things, observing things. So this has been happening, but I think even that tradition has weakened over the years. Now I don't find so many literary camps. There was a period when, right from the 1960s or so, when we had so many literary camps held in beautiful places. Sometimes it was in Malambura or Pichi, mostly in dam sites and all that. So a student, mostly meant for college students and all that. So they loved coming there and listening to the poets, and not only poets but writers, fiction writers also. They admired. Where they would tell them about their experiences and how to develop them, and listen to them patiently, tell them what is wrong with their poem, what is wrong with the story, and how it can be improved and all that. But I think that tradition at least needs to be kept alive, which is not happening. But now, and as a result, sadly, every writer today thinks that he or she is born to write, and he or she is, her writing or his writing can never be improved, which is not the case, as you very well know, as I know, and as any reader of forget other arts, poetry at least know that they write whatever comes to them, and because now there is no need of an editor also, they can publish in on the social media, on the Facebook, or wherever, on Twitter or Instagram, or in any of the, or they can have a blog. So publishing has become very easy, and that has made writing also easy, and that compels a lot of poets to take writing as a very easy kind of creative act, without passing through the pain and the kind of training, rigorous kind of training, by which I mean training in language, training in reading comprehension, training one's own imagination. Without any training, that is something sad, and that is happening not only in English, that is happening in all the languages also. So now there is a kind of equality among all the languages in that sense, because there's a lot of bad poetry being written in all languages, to be honest.
Okay. I think our time is up, and Sonia has reminded me. Thank you for this wonderful conversation. I don't know how much I have been helpful in carrying out this conversation with you, because I have been wanting to talk to you for a long time. Finally, I got a chance through this.
Yeah, it is very tragic that we had to meet like this, as images on a screen, and not as living full-blooded humans with very age. Yes.
Yeah, right.
Lasha, would we have a moment for one question?
I don't mind. I don't mind taking a question if you have the time, and if you don't have a program following.
Ask him.
Because I even wanted to read, which I am not going to do now, because I was only reading my early poems. I did not read my recent poem, but which I am not doing. But I can take the questions. All right. Yeah.
All right. Lasha, may I?
Yeah, sure.
Satchidanandan, I have two parts of the question.
Okay,
One
which
is
means I need do I need a pen, or okay, I'll remember.
No, Satchidanandan. Earlier on the discussion, you made a distinction between poetic imagination and fictional imagination. Would you like to sort of shed a little more light on that? Poetic imagination and fictional imagination.
Well, there are
That's one
points, as I
question.
said. Yeah. So I think I'll answer them one by one, because I'm likely to forget your first question. So I will answer them. I will also give brief answers, because all these questions require essays, which I cannot just write or speak now. So there are points where fictional imagination and poetic imagination come together. And that is why I said I like the kind of fiction written by somebody like Italo Calvino, or somebody like Marquez, whose imagination is fundamentally poetic. So there are, and also this happens in narrative poetry. especially now that we are also losing that tradition. Our epics were, Montessori used to say, Joseph Montessori, that our epics are actually novels. In those days, only verse forms were available. So Ramayana and Mahabharata and all of them happen to be written in verse, but they are actually novels written in verse. So that was a kind of narrative imagination working in poetry. And similarly, there is also a poetic imagination working in fiction even today, in a very imaginative fiction, especially fiction which is inspired a lot by fantasy or myth, fiction that uses language in very poetic ways with a lot of metaphor, or even creating a kind of music out of, like many black writers do, a music out of English language, which we had never found in the English language written by many of the famous English writers. So you find, especially a lot of new black writers, I find creating a new kind of music from English language. So there are fiction writers who have a kind of poetic imagination working in their fiction, while there are poets in whom narrative imagination is sometimes strong. Even I, when I write a narrative poem, I have written a few narrative poems, not many, then I am partly like a fiction writer. Because I have to have that structural kind of imagination. I have to have a plot. I have to have a narrative structure. Even though my poetry also works in it, in the form of the images I use, the metaphors I use, I am not telling a story straight. So there are points where they come together. But when you write a novel and when you write a poem, I think ultimately you are two different people working your way through language into very very different ways. So it is the link base. It is basically a difference of what I may call linguistic imagination, the way you imagine a language and bring a literary work into being. That is where fiction and poetry seem to differ from each other, even though, as I said, there are junctures or junctions where they come together and work together. And
Thank
your
you.
second?
Yeah, Sajimash, we live in very conflicted times, very difficult times, in every manner possible, conceivable. How do we think that poetry can have a transformative effect on the times that we inhabit? How can it sort of transform public imagination or a call to action? Given the times that all of us know, given the times that we inhabit today.
Yeah. I think we are living through the worst times independent India has ever passed through. I don't think anybody anybody who loves democracy will disagree with me. But poetry, I have always believed in the transformative power of poetry. But poetry transforms only very few people ultimately. And those people who are inspired by your poetry might take up other things. They might write articles. They might intervene intellectually. They might even become activists. And only through them the message ultimately goes down to the grassroots. So a poet can only begin a conversation. It has to be taken to its destination by other agents in between. But another kind of poetry can perhaps have a direct appeal, and that is what you call song. A song. When poetry becomes a song and it is sung melodiously, even which are originally poems, which are sung beautifully, they can perhaps reach more people. Even some of my more popular poems, they became popular not because of the strength of the poems, because I believe I have much better poems. But then, like Meera Padunnu, for example, everybody in Kerala knows Meera Padunnu, just because it was sung by famous G. Venugopal. It was part of an album, and everybody sings it in school competitions and college competitions and all that. Even though I don't think it is, of course, it is not a bad poem, perhaps, but I don't think it is one of my best poems. But then, music has a greater power in this sense, the communicative power, than poetry per se has. So when poetry is sung or dramatized, because a lot of poetry is written in prose forms these days, but even these prose forms can be performed, like dramas are performed. So poetry performances, whether they are musical or whether they are dramatic, they perhaps can do a lot to bring about a transformation in popular imagination and in the kind of resistance that we all want to see build up in the country. Not perhaps poetry per se, but poetry which is acted out, performed, poetry which is sung. So that's why I think those forms are extremely important these days. We had Ravi will be remembering, and Srinivas, you may also remember in the 70s we had those street plays, which were very important. A lot of people would come to see those street plays, and this is exactly the time when we should have those street plays, street theater, street poetry. We used to sing in villages and and we used to sing in Dalit colonies and all that. We used to present our poems there, and we used to perform. Even we used to use makeup. I still remember in Tellicheri and all that, when Kerala Kavita was released, K.D. Shankar Pillai, myself, we had makeup and we performed some African poems and some of our own poems in costumes. So we can perhaps use poetry in these ways to inspire more people, to inform them in a sense, and to make them conscious of what is actually happening in the country, to bring them the truth which is being concealed from them by the media. Media which should tell the truth are now used more, as we all know, to hide the truth. And perhaps poetry, not only poetry, all forms of literature and all forms of intellectual activity have that function this time. So we need to find new ways of communicating, taking literature to the people, taking all forms of imagination to the people. Poetry, what poetry per se cannot do, performances can perhaps.
Okay, I
Thank you
think
so
Satchida, another session is coming up at 8
Yeah,
o'clock.
yeah.
So we'll wind this up, and Sonia will talk to you about this.
Sure. Yeah.
Sonia?
Sir,
Yeah.
Satchidanandan sir, what do we say? It was an absolutely riveting session. And you were marvelous, and the way that you encapsulated all these times that have gone by and where we have ended is very, very important, because we were just talking about poetry having an avenue on social media, but I was just thinking whether that avenue has actually taken away the poetry from the streets and put them onto social media, where I suppose feedback is substituted by thumbs up. And a poet never really gets to know what people are actually thinking, because in passing, just as we throw glances at people, people send us a thumbs up, and you have to make of it whatever you will. So I guess
So Sonia, 1 second. I
yes.
think social media are also kind of, in fact, streets. The only problem, these streets are filled only with your friends and admirers, unlike the real street where you meet your foes or critics. That is,
Yes, exactly.
oh,
So there are no knife fights here, in that sense of the term. Yeah, people whom you like and and you have a choice to discard. You don't have to live with them. I think that makes a
true.
difference in a sense.
Yeah.
But as you were speaking, I realized that there is something spectacular about your poetry that has made it last through these decades. Because the way that you write and enunciate, it kind of touches chords in hearts in terms of relatability, particularly at a time when poetry has become increasingly abstract, increasingly minimalist, increasingly somehow removed and taken away to a certain space where it becomes distinctly inaccessible. So I guess where what I'm trying to say is that the accessibility that your poems afford, um, without losing any of their lyricism or their appeal, I think that is something that we need to take away and we need to remember, particularly when people write their poems. So thank you very much for traveling or taking us through on these travels. And I would like to kind of point out that we did not talk about your travel writing, and the poems that have come about through those miscellaneous travels. But I would like to thank Mr. Ravi Shankar for that beautiful, let's say, companionship that he provided, and this camaraderie that you people share. It has kind of shown through, and it has made everything wonderful. And to our audience who sat through a lot of interruptions and can you hear me, but their determination shows how much of an appeal you hold. And thank you everybody for this beautiful time that we have shared, and we hope to see you again in these channels, particularly Sachi sir, Rush, and everybody else who's here.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Ravi Shankar. We will be hopefully meeting personally once this pandemic is over, if it ever will be over. And Sonia, I also wanted to show a book which has just come out. I got my first copy today. It's called "I Am a Language." It is a collection of my poems on language and on poetry, which has come out from Thowley Books.
Does it have the one on cactus? My language is like a cactus or something. I bleed, and that's
I am a language. That is the. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe we'll just round off with the sound of you reading one of those poems at least, please.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we don't want to stop with my voice in this. I think we should stop with you.
Yeah, then I'll read the shortest, actually, the shortest possible about languages, because all these poems are about languages and about poetry. This whole book of more than 260 pages. And another book of 260 pages came out very recently. These are my travel poems.
Yes,
called,
this is what I was referring to.
Yeah, No Borders for Me. And a collection of my love poems came out a little before that. This is from another publisher called Hawakal. It is called The Whispering Tree. And of course, earlier, Poetry Wala had published The Missing Rib, a big collection of my poetry, about 700 pages of my poetry.
You are keeping busy, aren't you?
No, that is by way of advertisement. And now I'll finish with this little very short poem, I have a series of poems, as you know, on travel. This is also from a travel poem. Most of those poems are sequences. One poem containing several poems. And this is from one of my last travels to Spain. Three of us Indian poets had readings in 5 cities in Spain. We started from Madrid. And that travel in Spain gave me several poems, including one on Picasso's Guernica, which for the first time I saw in the original in the Queen's Museum. But I will read this poem called The Unknown Tongues. This was written after a reading, listening to the many languages spoken by the because we went to Avila. Avila is well known as a pilgrim center for Christians. You all know that, the Mary of Avila. So we went to Avila, and in Avila when we were walking, we could hear so many people from all over the world talking in different languages. And this is a response to what I heard, The Unknown Tongues. Avila, 10th August 2019. Listening to the many tongues spoken by the pilgrims at the St. Teresa Church. I don't know Awadhi or Azerbaijani, Kashmiri or Kurdish, Konkani or Kokborok, Gondi or Kirundi, Bangla or Burmese, Marwari or Malagasy, Mundari or Mandarin, Sindhi or Sudanese, 1,000 tongues besides. But I know the tongues of cuckoo and gecko, leaves and elves, deer and fish, rain and earth, body and wind, sea and sky, flower and star, sun and snow, of mind, and thousands besides, for I know Malayalam. Thank you. Thank you for you. Thank you, Rash, and thank you, Sonia, and
thank you, sir.
all my friends who attended.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Nirada. Yes. Srinivas, thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you, Sonia. We'll meet again sometime, and also Rash will physically meet.
Oh yeah, certainly, certainly we'll do
And
that.
we are working together on a women's poetry anthology from Malayalam.
Okay.